conversation that we might have about the origin of life on this planet very often can become a dispute about the existence of a higher being, whether or not there is any evidence of a God, whether or not mankind really even needs a God at all. If we're honest about it, we would have to admit that this is one of the key arguments in the debate between evolution and creationism. One view relies very heavily on a supernatural force that is capable of wisely designing and constructing everything that is. And the other view is firmly based upon the notion that if such a force or power even does exist, it is not required in the chain of events that has brought everything into existence and established the complexity of life as we know it. The debate over the origin and development of life on this planet is undoubtedly a question of whether or not the God of the Bible exists. Generally, those who embrace the scientific explanation of the origin of life will scoff at the idea of a traditional being called God. They consider the concept to be either an emotional or psychological crutch for lesser minds, simply childish myths meant to explain things which these lesser minds just cannot understand. Now, that's not to say that all scientists do not believe in God, for many do. But the evolution theory that is offered as an explanation of how everything came to be is basically a rejection of the Bible and its teachings, an effort to demonstrate that in order to exist, man does not need God. So our plan this afternoon is to look at the two options, creationism and evolution, in a simple fashion, to get our minds thinking about life on this planet and the existence of everything that is around us. Are these things the result of intelligent design or of a lucky happenstance that occurred because certain conditions were right? I intend to lay out some fairly basic facts about the theory of evolution while pointing out the problems or some problems with the science that is involved. And then I would like to spend some time looking at a few things in nature and ask ourselves whether or not these things could have actually come into existence by a very slow process over millions of years. So what I hope to present to you is evidence for the position that I believe in, the position that I believe is true, which is that all of this could not have happened by chance, that there must be a God whose wisdom, power, and capabilities are far beyond anything that we can understand or even imagine. And this, I believe, is an issue with the other side. The thought that if man in all of his wisdom cannot explain something in terms that he can understand, then it cannot be. No, if anything, science will teach us that there is much that exists in this world that we cannot perceive with our five senses. For example, you cannot see, smell, hear, touch, or taste gravity, and yet, there it is. It does exist. Before we begin in earnest, however, I would like to say something about the position that some creationists have taken on Genesis chapter 1. It seems that some creationists, being influenced by scientific proof, specifically about the age of the earth, have a need to somehow reconcile the two opposing views. They accept that there must have been a God involved, but they reject that he accomplished the work of creation in 6 days, as Genesis 1 plainly states. The result of this kind of thinking is the theory of theistic evolution, which is based upon the idea that the days of Genesis 1 are somehow not literal days, but that a much longer period of time is being represented by the word day. And this allows than for the millions of years that evolutionary science demands. And this is how they try to reconcile creationism with evolution. Theistic evolution declares that God used a very slow process like evolution to bring about the complexity of life that exists today from a very primal condition hundreds of millions of years ago. It contends that where life was not able to evolve naturally, well, that's where God stepped in. For instance, how does a reptile's limb evolve into a bird's wing naturally? Well, we'll be brief on this point, but it is worth mentioning. So if we look at the Genesis record, even if we cannot accept the obvious logic of the phrase the evening and the morning or the first day that we see in verse 5, then verses 14 through 18 of that chapter clearly refute the idea that a day in Genesis 1 is not a 24-hour period. Let's read that together. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night. And let them be for signs and seasons and for days and years. Let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. Now we understand that God had already divided light from darkness in verse 4. Now he divides day from night and gives two lights in the sky, one to dominate the day, which is obviously called the sun, and the other to dominate the night, and that would be the moon. So where it says he made a greater light to rule the day, and where it says, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night," well, that word day is the exact same word that is used in verse 5, 8, 13, 19, 23, and 31, where it says, "And the evening and the morning were the first day, and the evening and the morning were the second day," and so on. The division of day from night, the cycle of light from dark, is understood by the youngest of our children. And so you don't need to be a scientist to figure out what the Bible is talking about. If we believe in a God who made all things so intricate and interdependent, from the tiny, tiny atoms to the massive galaxies, why would we assume that he couldn't do it in 6 days, which is what his word plainly declares he did? Enough of theistic evolution. Let's take a look at the building blocks of scientific evolution theory. These are the three elements that are considered to be vital to the process of evolution: natural selection, random mutations, and pangenesis. So let's take a brief look at these. Some of them might be unfamiliar to you. A natural selection is probably the best known component of the evolution theory. Natural selection declares that certain forces will dictate the survival of a particular developed trait. So we'll use an example of some beetle bugs. The green beetles may be more visible to predators than the brown beetles. Predators like birds. Okay? And because of this, there will be fewer green beetles. Makes sense. And if there are fewer green beetles, then there will be fewer green beetle babies. And eventually the green beetle would become extinct, leaving only the brown beetle. That's fairly simple. But by itself, that process could hardly be a progenitor of a new species. This natural selection does not demonstrate that the green beetles became brown beetles, just that the green beetles were removed from the population. So this process is more of a fine-tuning within a class of existing animals, making fewer types, not more, and more is what evolution requires. In regard to natural selection, consider for a moment the amazing human eye. The eye is like a top-of-the-line modern camera. It contains a self-adjusting aperture, an automatic focus system, an inner surface that minimizes the scattering of stray light. But the sensitivity range of the eye, which gives us excellent vision in both sunlight and moonlight, far surpasses that of any film. The eye's neural circuitry enables it to automatically enhance contrast, and its color analysis system enables it to quickly adjust to varying light conditions. Now, Darwin would have us to believe that something this intricate is the product of natural selection, a daisy chain of small changes that were selectively perpetuated genetically, as is explained by Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins is a noted evolutionary biologist, and this is what he says. He says, given enough time, thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, whatever, and enough material, that being millions of individuals in a species, many genetic changes will occur that result in slight improvements in a system or a structure, such as the eye. So with all its intricate and amazing characteristics, we're led to believe that these things simply developed over enough time and through the influence of enough creatures. Well, if that's so, then that very same system that has given us the miracle of the eye has not removed the appendix. And this guy's in terrible pain. And I know, I've been there. Mine is no longer with us. Okay, and that appendage is, by all medical accounts, more of a danger to people than of any known use. Now, interestingly, we are told that the appendix has lost its use because of evolution. And yet it remains, despite the fact that it is no longer useful, supposedly. So this is an apparent contradiction to the function of natural selection. If natural selection can give us the eye, that amazing characteristics of the eye, why cannot it take away the appendix? It doesn't make sense. Again, these are going to be brief. Some of them get a little bit more involved. Again, I think we're probably more familiar with natural selection now. Random mutations, we'll leave it up. Random mutations is a key element in evolution that is made to account for the necessary changes between species and types of creatures. Just as an example, how many differences could we find between a fish and a bird? And yet evolution asks us to believe that birds came from reptiles and reptiles evolved from fish over that very long, extended period of time. Random mutation in the theory has to work with pangenesis, which we're going to consider next. Mutation is considered to be the circumstance of change, while pangenesis is the vehicle of passing the mutation on to the next generation. Just keep in mind how many mutations must line up to change a fish's gill to a reptile's lung. Never mind changing a fin into a functioning leg. But there are serious problems with random mutations. Contrary to what evolution requires, mutation is not a beneficial operation. Mutations on the genetic level, which is what evolution depends on, are detrimental to a creature because they are simply copying errors in DNA, our genetic code. Now let's consider just a few mutations. In body cells, faulty replication of DNA manifests itself as cancer. Sunlight's mutation-inducing power causes skin cancer. A cigarette's mutation-inducing power causes lung cancer. In gender-related cells, faulty copying of whole chromosome number 21 results in a child with Down syndrome. That's why that slide is up there. It came up prematurely. Now, likely we are familiar with Down syndrome. This is a condition which science has proven is a genetic mistake, the result of the alteration of a specific chromosome. Every creature has a distinct number of chromosomes. In humans, every cell contains 46 chromosomes. Now, other creatures have different numbers. A dog, for instance, has 78 chromosomes per cell. Now, chromosomes normally come in pairs that are a matched set. Down syndrome occurs because of a specific error in genetic coding, which results in 3 copies of a certain chromosome in the cells. I have here a quote from the Genetic Home Reference. It's a website that puts into layman terms exactly what this means. You might want to look at the bullet points as I read through, because this quote is where those bullet points are taken from. Down syndrome is a chromosomal condition that is associated with intellectual disability, a characteristic facial appearance, and weak muscle tone in infancy. People with Down syndrome may have a variety of birth defects. About half of all affected children are born with a heart defect. Individuals with Down syndrome have an increased risk of developing several medical conditions. Delayed development and behavioral problems are often reported in children with Down syndrome. Affected individuals' speech and language develop later and more slowly than in children without Down syndrome. An affected individual's speech may be more difficult to understand. Behavioral issues can include attention problems, obsessive compulsive behavior, stubbornness, tantrums. Most cases of Down syndrome result from trisomy 21, which means each cell in the body has 3 copies of chromosome 21 instead of the usual 2 copies. This condition of 3 copies of a chromosome account for almost 1/4 of pregnancy loss from spontaneous miscarriages. Most cases of Down syndrome are not inherited. They are not inherited. And so it is, as far as we know, very random. And yet, it is estimated that Down syndrome affects 1 in every 691 births in the U.S. So this genetic coding error, this particular mutation, if you will, is hardly advantageous. Obviously, cancer is not advantageous mutation either. And that's the problem with random mutations. Mutations are not beneficial to the creature. The theory of evolution teaches that over time, by natural causes, non-living chemicals became a living cell. Then this single-celled life form gave rise to more advanced life forms. In essence, over millions of years, increases in genetic information caused by mutations plus natural selection developed all the life forms that we see on the earth today. That is what evolution asks us to believe. For molecules to man evolution to happen, there would need to be a gain in new information within the organism's genetic coding or genetic material. For instance, for a single-celled organism such as an amoeba to evolve into something like a cow, new information would need to develop over time that would code for ears and lungs, the brain, the legs, all of those things. And they would have to have mutated and developed not so randomly, but using those base pairs and affecting very complex and ordered DNA. There have been a few arguable cases of information gaining mutations, but for evolution to be true, there would need to be billions of advantageous mutations occurring in a very specific order. Now, personally, I wouldn't want to bet those odds. Additionally, these mutations would need to be related to the environment in which the creature exists, or else there would be no advantage for the creature. In other words, it wouldn't do for a fish to randomly develop something that it cannot use in water, like a lung or a leg, okay? So these mutations are not so random. The last of the three elements of the evolution theory that we'll consider this afternoon is called pangenesis. And this is a term that was used by Charles Darwin, the father of modern evolution. And the concept was not his own. He borrowed it from a previous evolution theorist named Lamarck, who presented his ideas in the early 1800s. Now, what Darwin meant by this word is that there is an ability to pass on through genetic inheritance a trait that is developed in a single generation. What this means is that if a person becomes stronger by lifting heavy weights, then his descendants would genetically inherit a similar strength. And this is how the neck of the giraffe is explained. Individual animals passed on slight alterations in neck size caused by stretching to reach the leaves that the other animals haven't eaten. Problem is, pangenesis has been conclusively proven to be false and is replaced with something different called Mendel's laws of inheritance. Gregor Mendel published his findings in 1866, just 7 years after Darwin's Origin of the Species. Now here's a simple explanation of Mendel's two laws. The law of segregation states that every person has a matching pair of genes which determine a particular trait, like your eye color or your hair color, your facial characteristics, your body type, okay? Each parent contributes one gene of each type to the offspring. So you get, in regards to just say your hair color, you get one gene from dad, one gene from mom. You don't get 2 and 2, you get one from each. Depending on which gene is dominant will determine a bias in the child towards that parent's trait. Now, we've all heard he has his father's eyes, or she has her mother's hair. Okay? And these kinds of similarities between child and parent is what the law of segregation is meant to explain. The second law, the law of independent assortment, states that dominance in genetic makeup is independent one trait from another. What that means is that a cat may inherit its color from its mother, but it might inherit the tail length from its father. So, the point is that each of us is a random assortment of hereditary traits of both of our parents. So let's go back to natural selection for a moment in our minds. How could an advantageous mutation, if such a thing actually existed, how could this mutation being found in one parent survive the effects of these laws, where each trait in the offspring is determined by the dominance of one gene over the other, and apparently random effects of independent assortment? So if the dad has this mutation, what is the likelihood of passing it on to the children? Well, it depends on whether or not his gene is dominant, and it also depends on whether or not that particular trait comes from his DNA. Without doubt, any such small change would quickly be lost by dilution into the gene pool of that creature's descendants. So in other words, if there was a mutation that was passed on, it would become less and less and less of a characteristic, not more and more and more. And evolution requires more, not less. The theory of evolution depends on a combination of both of these factors: random mutations that must be inherited through genetic coding. But again, mutations are not beneficial, and Mendel's laws have been recently shaken. Here is an excerpt taken from the New York Times, the science section, which was dated in March 23rd of 2005, and it's in an article that's talking about inheriting mutated genetic code. In a startling discovery, geneticists at Purdue University say they have found plants, and that's the plant that they were looking at. I couldn't pronounce its name, that's why I didn't put it in here. They have found plants that possess a corrected version of a defective gene inherited from both of their parents, as if some handy backup copy with the right version had been made in the grandparents' generation or earlier. The finding implies that some organisms may contain a cryptic backup copy of their genome that bypasses the usual mechanisms of heredity. And what he's talking about there is those Mendel laws. If confirmed, it would represent an unprecedented exception to the laws of inheritance discovered by Gregor Mendel in the 19th century. The discovery also raises interesting biological questions, including whether it gets in the way of evolution, which depends on mutations changing an organism rather than being put right by a backup system. That's amazing. This generation of plants had received mutated genetic coding from both parents, and yet there seemed to be this backup that corrected it. So that next generation of plants wasn't mutated at all. It was normal. And what the writer here is loath to admit is that this discovery sends the theory of inherited genetic mutation right out of the proverbial window. And also, the genetic code in every living thing has built-in limitations. It seems designed to stop a plant or a creature from stepping too far away from the average. Every series of breeding experiments that has ever taken place has experienced a finite limit to breeding possibilities. Genetic coding only allows for modest change, not radical change. Left to their own devices, artificially bred species usually die out, either because they are sterile or because they are less robust, or they quickly revert to the original design. So these are the three very necessary building blocks of the evolution theory. Natural selection is hardly revolutionary in its ordinary method of selecting, and the real probability of coding loss through genetic dilution. In other words, it cannot be passed on because of the fact that each child receives genetic coding from each parent. The random mutation aspect is demonstrably harmful rather than beneficial. And the last of the three, pangenesis or Mendel's laws, whatever you want to call it, cannot be counted on for permanent change. Instead, things that are left to themselves will revert back to what they were before any mutation occurred. If things are forced, however, there are definite limitations to reproducing the change through succeeding generations. Now, that last bit is seen in the simple fact that there is no such thing as female mules. The intentional altering of genetic code by breeding different species which have different numbers of chromosomes, in this case a donkey and a horse, has created a situation where only male mules can be produced. In evolutionary terms, this situation would only assure extinction by an inability to reproduce. If there are only one sex, you cannot reproduce. And there are no such thing as female mules because the genetic coding will not allow for it. So this would not, or could not, result in the creation of a new species or even a new type of animal in a certain class. So these observations raise some pretty serious questions and concerns about the possibility of evolution as a function of developing all the varieties of life that we see around us in this earth. So we don't really need to talk about missing links in the evolutionary chain or the inconsistencies in dating methods which have been used to prove evolution. If the fundamental building blocks of the evolution theory cannot be demonstrated as factual, then the house that modern science has built upon that foundation simply cannot stand. But how can we prove that the Genesis account of creation is true? Obviously, none of us were there to witness it, and creation is not something that we can replicate to see how it all worked. All we have is this book, which devotes just a couple chapters to tell its amazing story. But we don't need to prove the Genesis process through a demonstration like some sort of scientific experiment. We just need to prove that this book is true and that its claims are real. And this in itself will validate what we are told in Genesis chapter 1. So how do we know that the Bible is true and that its claims are real? Well, a few months ago, we had a talk in this hall on this very subject. We looked at how archaeology supports the historical record of the Bible. We can also look very critically at Bible prophecies and see how God's book has accurately and consistently foretold future events, particularly concerning the tiny nation of Israel throughout its history. Even the survival of the Bible itself is a testament to it being the Word of God, retaining its remarkable integrity and remaining intact for thousands of years, as proven by the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s. These scrolls demonstrate how little the Old Testament record has changed after being copied countless times since before the time of Christ, over 2,000 years ago. We also have some very interesting witnesses, silent witnesses, in the earth around us that by their very design confound the theory of evolution. Things that give testimony to the amazing work of a creator who made all things according to his purpose. So let's take a few moments and consider just a couple examples that demonstrate the creative hand of our God. Without question, slow development over large periods of time is one of the most important requirements of the evolution theory. Evolutionists will tell us that minute changes resulting in radical differences taking millions of years has produced the variety of living organisms that exist in our world. I would like for us to, at this point, consider a plant that exhibits an extraordinary characteristic that makes it stand apart from the majority of plant life. Presumably, such a radical change in the sphere of evolutionary development must have occurred very gradually over a large period of time. Now, this is a plant that we're all familiar with. Some of us have probably grown them in our backyards. That would be the strawberry. Looks good. Now, we all know how basic plant reproduction occurs. Following pollination, which is the fertilization process, a seed is formed. The seed contains all the genetic information to ensure that the reproducing plant, in the words of Genesis 1, brings forth after its own kind. Now, normally the seed is found in some material that will increase the probability of wide distribution of the seeds. In our example of the strawberry plant, the seed is found in the fruit, and that's enjoyed by most people. I know some people can't eat strawberries, but I think most people enjoy eating strawberries. The birds also enjoy strawberry fruit, and the birds are very instrumental in distributing strawberry seeds far and wide. But the strawberry plant is not limited to reproducing through seeding. The strawberry plant has the ability to produce offspring plants by sending out stem growths that are normally referred to as runners. Now, these runners have points or nodes at which a new strawberry plant will grow. This form of reproduction of the strawberry plant affects our consideration of evolution in two ways. First, the runners are of absolutely no use to the species unless they produce perfect plants in a place where those plants can grow. Now, the runner starts out as a stem from the center portion of the plant, and it grows upward. Now, the runner has to grow to such a length that it can reach beyond the widest leaves and beyond the roots of the parent plant. And then something amazing happens. It then bends over to reach the ground. And it's at this point that the new plant has to be produced with leaves, stalks, and a growing center capable of developing into a full strawberry plant. The part of the new plantlet where it comes in contact with the ground must be capable of developing a root rapidly beyond the root system of the parent plant. Okay? If that runner isn't long enough and the new plant doesn't reach far enough, one, it will likely be under the leaves of the parent plant and will not survive, or two, it will set down its roots and it will interfere with the parent plant. So that runner has to grow to such a length that when it reaches down, it's beyond the leaves and it's beyond the roots. And that little plantlet that you can see in that picture will sprout its stem and its leaves, and when it touches the ground, it'll send out roots very rapidly. At the same time, the parent plant will continue to grow fruit with seeds in the normal fashion of the majority of plants. So how could this type of reproduction develop incrementally as evolution requires? Remember, a runner without the complete and perfect plant in the correct place beyond the parent plant would be detrimental. And so by the rules of natural selection, it would be eliminated. Evolution requires that each adaptation that becomes permanent through genetic inheritance must be advantageous to the species in some way, or else it is discarded. So the whole thing, that stem that becomes the runner, the plantlet with its own stem and leaves and root system, would have to develop in a single generation in order to not be eliminated by natural selection. That doesn't make sense evolutionary-wise, because evolution tells us it's a teeny, tiny, minute changes over millions of years, not a single generation. Now, this brings us to the second way that this form of reproduction of the strawberry plant contradicts the theory of evolution. The runner process, which is very advantageous to the farmer, is actually not an advantage to the plant itself. Energies and resources that would normally be devoted to growth and fruit production are now redirected to the runner. Now, the evolutionist can't have his argument both ways. He tells us that the growth of fruit or runners is solely in the interest of the species itself, or they both have to be. They both have to be. And yet, logically, they cannot be. If the strawberry plant was producing fruit with seeds inside, the way most plants do, and that runner system was somehow mutatedly, genetically created, if it was detrimental to the strawberry producing fruit, which it is, farmers will tell you that. As soon as those runners come out, the fruit becomes less. Well, if that's the case, then the runners would have never developed to what they are. Never. Evolutionarily impossible. The evolutionist tells us that the principle of survival of the fittest is an ever-watchful force that is capable of selecting the smallest of variations if it gives the plant any advantage in its struggle for existence. If that's so, then it must also be capable of rejecting or weeding out any variation that proves to be unprofitable or detrimental. It is demonstrated beyond any debate that those plants that grow runners do not produce half as much fruit. So if the strawberry plant was to throw out its rudimentary runners as a first step in developing that whole system of reproduction with that little baby plant, if the first step was throwing out those runners, and that was detrimental to the fruit producing of that plant, then it would not happen. It would, by natural selection, by the laws of evolution, it would be discarded. And we would not see that. And yet that exists in creation. So briefly, I would like for you to consider another amazing and unique member of the plant world, and that would be the Venus flytrap. Now, the leaves of this plant in their normal state lay flat. On the leaves there are short, stiff hairs that act as sensitive trigger system. When anything touches the hairs enough to bend them, the leaves snap shut and entrap whatever is in that unlucky position. How the leaves actually react is unknown. Plants do not have nervous systems. They don't have muscles. The plant is also very highly selective. It will open up and spit out, or actually allow to drop out. It doesn't spit it out, but it'll allow to drop out anything which it trapped that is not a live bug. So a pebble or a nut or even a dead bug will be rejected by the plant. It'll snap shut because those hairs are being bent, but in time it will open up, and that whatever that thing is will drop out because it is not a living bug. Should a live bug enter into the trap, it is captured by the leaves and subjected to a digestive secretion which will break down the edible parts of the insect. Finally, when the juices of the plant have done their work, the leaves will open up again and the carcass of the insect will be removed either by wind or by rain. That's a truly remarkable plant. Apparently, it needs to sense and understand quite a few things, such as what is the nature of what it has captured. Is it a rock? Is it a bug? Is it a living bug or is it a dead bug? It needs to understand these things because it's going to react differently. That's the next step. It needs to decide what to do with what it has captured. And also, it must be able to operate its mechanism as well as retrieve its nourishment in a very unconventional way for a plant. How could this come about? And the method that is suggested by evolution, minute changes over millions of years. I found an interesting article on the BBC's website in a section called Earth News. And this article from 2009 has the heading, Venus Flytrap Origins Discovered. And it starts with the line, The origin of the voracious Venus flytrap has been uncovered, and that sounds pretty conclusive. The scientists involved contend that the flytrap evolved from a plant that has a sticky substance on which bugs get caught and end up being eaten by the plant. As you're reading through this article, you find that the proof that these plants evolved is somewhat less convincing. While fanciful and imaginative language is used, language that seems to be somewhat unscientific. I'll give you a couple of quotes now these are from the scientists, okay? And they're being cited in the article. They say, first, the ancestral plant, or the beginning plant that started this whole evolutionary path that we're going down here, the ancestral plant must have adapted to move its tentacles and leaves in a particular direction, giving it a greater chance of sticking to and engulfing a passing insect. And of course, the question immediately should come to mind, well, how did the plant do that? How did it adapt to move in a particular direction in order to catch more bugs? They go on. Next, it sped up how quickly it detected prey and tried to respond. Again, how can a plant with no cognitive capabilities, without a nervous or muscular system, accomplish this? How could it speed up how quickly it detected prey and reacted to that prey? Then the plant would have to find a way to become selective. So it only tried to trap live prey and not any debris that landed upon it. So the plant has to find a way. Sounds fishy to me. Finally, it must have evolved its tentacles into sensory hairs and teeth that detect and wrap around prey, respectively, while also losing its sticky glands and growing new digestive glands capable of digesting the victim's corpse. The plant did that. There are so many aspects of this unique plant that require intelligent design. How can a plant make the kinds of decisions and adjustments to bring about so amazing a system that is so unlike all of the other organisms of its type? Another interesting and important feature of creation is something called symbiosis, which is defined as any of several living arrangements between members of two different species, mutually beneficial associations between different kinds of organisms. And we also know this to be independence. This condition of mutual benefit, it's commonly understood, and it can be easily observed by anybody who ventures outdoors. The problem with symbiosis for the evolutionist is explaining how organisms that have developed independent of each other could have existed without the symbiotic relationships that are so necessary in our world. In simplest terms, how did the bee survive without the flower, or vice versa? I recently read an article in the Santa Fe, New Mexico newspaper, online obviously, I haven't been to Santa Fe recently, that was talking about this very question. Apparently, contention over recently discovered fossil records has caused some heated debates in the scientific community. The conventional theory always was that bees and flowering plants must have evolved around the same time. Now, this opinion is driven solely by the fact that the two are so obviously dependent upon each other for survival. Now, that seems very logical, but it seems somewhat unscientific, because science supposedly relies on data and physical evidence, not on things like symbiotic relationships that currently exist. Anyway, a challenge was made to this long-standing theory by the discovery of what appears to be bees' nests and fossil records that predate the accepted time frame of the emergence of flowering plants. So those who hold to the old position vehemently reject that fossil records prove pre-flower bee nests. It can't be. How could that be? But at the end of the article, one of the primary proponents of the old theory had to say this. This is what he had to say. It could turn out, 10 years from now, that someone will find a real fossilized bee's nest from the Triassic period, and that's before flowers, and we'll just have to change our theory. So did bees and flowers evolve together or not? If the conventional theory is based on the idea that they must have evolved together because of the relationship that they now have, what evidence would ever cause this gentleman to change his theory? Something interesting about the bee-flower relationship is the way that it has a far greater impact on life on this planet than just a happy, mutual, beneficial partnership between two species or two dissimilar organisms. There is a very real concern in many countries around the world today about decreasing honeybee populations. The Washington Post had an article in 2006 on the problem, and this is a quote from that article that shows how potentially devastating the situation could become. Unless someone or something stops it soon, the mysterious killer that is wiping out many of the nation's honeybees could have a devastating effect on America's dinner plate, perhaps even reducing us to glorified bread and water diet. Honeybees don't just make honey. They pollinate more than 90 of the tastiest flowering crops that we have, among them apples, nuts, avocados, soybeans, asparagus, broccoli, celery, squash, cucumbers, and lots of the really sweet and tart stuff too, including citrus fruit, peaches, kiwis, cherries, blueberries, cranberries, strawberries, cantaloupes, other melons. In fact, about 1/3 of the human diet comes from insect-pollinated plants, and the honeybee is responsible for 80% of that pollination. And that's according to the USDA. Even cattle, which feed on alfalfa, depend on bees. So if the collapse worsens, we could end up being stuck with grains and water, says Kevin Hackett, the national program leader for the USDA's bee pollination program. He says, this is the biggest general threat to our food supply. Another newspaper, The Independent, out of England, reported this in 2011. Declines in managed bee colonies seen increasingly in Europe and in the US in the past decade are now also being observed in China and Japan, and there are first signs of African collapses from Egypt. This is according to a report from the United Nations Environment Program. So this situation with the honeybee is quickly becoming a global crisis. This concern about the survival of one small species and the impact that its extinction would have on life on our planet clearly demonstrates the principle that life, as we know it, is a symbiotic dance that depends on many interrelated factors in order to exist. Life is a complex, symbiotic experience day after day after day. How can we imagine a world where these relationships developed over millions of years when breaking just one relationship would have such a devastating effect? Life on this planet is a delicate balance of many things, an interwoven fabric of interdependent organisms and processes all cooperating together and codependent upon one another. There are many varieties of life forms, plants and animals, birds, fish, reptiles, insects, etc. Each is different, each is special in its design and function, and each has its own place and the delicate balance. There are so many intricate and imperceptible aspects of life that function completely outside of our understanding, and new things are being discovered at an incredible rate, which continue to confound and amaze us. Science tries to claim these new discoveries as its own in an effort to validate its theories of the origin of life. Yet those who read and believe the Word of God see more evidence of His handiwork, more proof that all of this couldn't have come about by chance. The creation around us speaks clearly to us about the undeniable existence of God if we will but listen. The Apostle Paul said as much in his letter to the Romans in chapter 1. For the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. What Paul means here is that God, in the way He made His creation, has designed things that we can see, things that are clearly visible, so that we can learn about things that we cannot see. He can teach us valuable spiritual lessons in the things that we see around us in the earth. The water cycle, for example, where droplets are drawn up into the sky to form clouds and then rain down again. This holds a spiritual lesson. Why the sky is blue. And why large bodies of water are blue, because they reflect the sky. It's a spiritual lesson. Why are trees green? What does that mean? Why the light of day chases away the darkness of night. All of these things, and a myriad more, God has instilled spiritual lessons. But most of man refuses to listen. As Paul continues in that quote in Romans 1, because that when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds, and four-footed beasts, and creeping things. Of course, Paul is talking here of idolatry, where people used to worship images of animals and men. But is evolution, with its basic attack on the existence of God, that much different? The word changed in that quote, changed the glory. Well, that means to transfer or to exchange. And one thing that the theory of evolution has done is take away God's glory, or His credit, as we might say, for His mighty work of creation, and transferred it to the creatures from which man presumably evolved. This theory changes the wondrous power of creation into a process of chance, performed in impossible circumstances, which consequently places man as the apex of the whole process for his own glory and his own satisfaction. The intricate and interdependent dance of life that goes on day after day demonstrates that there must be purpose in the design, that there is a God who is greater than ourselves. Yet man prefers to take God out of the way, to say that God is simply not needed, that God has not done the things which He has declared in His Word. I'd like to leave you with some thoughts from David the psalmist. When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars, which thou hast ordained, what is man, that thou art mindful of him? And the Son of Man, that thou visitest him? For thou hast made him a little lower than the angels, and hast crowned him with glory and honor. Thou madest him to have dominion over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, yea, and the beasts of the field, the fowl of the air, and the fish of the sea, and whatsoever passes through the paths of the seas. O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is thy name in all the earth.